associations, or what you might hear referred to as homeowners associations, really have to face on a really day-to-day basis. And sometimes people don't really think about the fact that POAs have to really face these sorts of challenges. So let's get into it. So the first thing, I always have to give a disclaimer. I am an attorney after all, to let you guys know that this is the law based on, as it exists of today, October 3rd, 2023. I will not be presenting any legal advice to you today, but this presentation is only going to be for educational purposes. If you need legal advice or have any other questions, you can consult an attorney. And as Elena mentioned, I'm going to leave some time at the end of the presentation today to answer some of your questions if you have any. So here are our goals for today. We are going to talk about the following things that affect property owners associations. So the first thing is inflation. That's something that not only affects property owners associations, but has been really affecting all of us. Natural disasters, especially here in Texas. Insurance requirements. We'll talk a little bit about agriculture. I'll make you guys laugh during that portion of the presentation. We will discuss a little bit about artificial intelligence, because this is not only something that's become a booming, thing that's affecting everyone, but it affects property owners associations as well. The mass purchase of electronic vehicles and how charging stations could affect a POA. We'll talk about that. Social media, and then if we have time, we'll get into the changing demographic of owners. So again, these are just a few trends that are challenges that property owners associations face. And these are some things that you might not consider actually affecting your HOA or your community association, but they actually do. And so I want to start off by talking a little bit about inflation, because it is related to a few of the other topics in the paper. And you can see some of the statistics that I've put here. For example, the Consumer Price Index is continuing to see a 5% growth year over year. The Food Index is up 8.1%. In general, the price for everything has increased, and inflation is at its highest in the past 40 years. And of course, we know a lot of that has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic, shortage in materials, supply increase and that kind of thing. But how this relates to associations is that annual assessments and the costs of doing business are on the rise. So when I say the cost of doing business, I mean things like management company fees, insurance premiums, which I'll talk about, maintenance services, and utilities. These are all part of a normal POA's budget, and they're continuously going up. And so when I say POA, that's interchangeable with Property Owners Association, Community Association, and HOA, for those of you who may not be familiar with those terms. Now, it's really interesting because, of course, the POA itself does experience inflation, but how does it combat this inflation? It's something that we're all dealing with. Everyone in communities are dealing, and if there's I can't remember the statistic right now, but there's a very large portion of people that live in property owners associations. And so inflation is a really big deal. But to combat this, associations have to consider increasing their budgets every year because they need more money to cover rising operation costs. So in the property code, there's a requirement that the association kind of review its budget and make any changes to, or additions, subtractions, or whatever to its budget annually at a meeting. And so that requirement's really important, because that budget is going to reflect how the association takes care of the community for the entire year. So budgets are really important. But obviously, the main source of revenue, or the main source of income for an association, is the annual maintenance assessment that's paid by a homeowner that owns a house within the community. It's not always feasible for the association to raise their assessments every year because, well, one, a lot of people just don't have the money to pay these higher assessments, but also the method by which you might increase the annual assessment could be difficult for an association to do. Generally, the governing documents will serve really as an impediment to raising the assessments, because associations have to obtain 2/3 or a majority of the voting members in the community to improve or approve an increase. And that's a really high threshold to meet, and it's very difficult. So if you think about it, in a community of 1,000 people, you have to have 2/3 of those people actually sign on and approve to increase the assessment. And a lot of times it's difficult for the association to even access all of those people for a variety of reasons, right? Sometimes the people don't actually live there. That's a rental property, or it's just far too many people for them to even get to. Sometimes an assessment increase would require like canvassing the community and that kind of thing. So it gets really complicated. And that's kind of, an understatement. So in addition to higher assessments being, problematic to even implement, higher assessments can also lead to a higher delinquency rate. So assessments are generally more than half of the POA's budget. So if you have a high delinquency rate, that can really be a major issue. Historically, more than 1/3 of all POAs do not have adequate funding already. And so that means that they don't have enough money in their cash reserves to be able to pay for things that come up, like unexpected bills or some sort of repair or maintenance issue that needs to be taken care of. There might even need to be a need for a special assessment in the future. And sometimes the declaration, which is the governing document, allows for an association to levy a special assessment, which is a one-time payment that's made by homeowners to take care of like a major capital expenditure. And if that's something that a homeowner can't pay for, then of course that's going to lead to late or non-existing payments and increase the delinquency rate and affect the association financially overall. Well, how does the association address these issues? Well, it could, make sure that when it is planning every year and doing its budget, as I mentioned, they could plan for capital expenditures. And the association really needs to take into consideration certain things like labor and energy cost increases, supply issues, and things like that. So budgeting is really, really important. And while legal counsel doesn't really have the responsibility of being a part of creation or approving the association's budget, as attorneys, we do need to make sure that the association is establishing their budget in the proper way. And those rules are listed there in the property code. Section 209.051 is one of those that kind of specifically lays out what the association has to do as far as adopting its budget in the proper way. So now we're going to move on a little bit to natural disasters. And this is another major concern, especially here in Texas. And I'm sure that words like Allison, Ike, Harvey, Rita, and even Uri, most recently, these probably are like triggering a little PTSD in all of us. Of course, Texas is no stranger to natural disasters, but did you know that flooding is the most common disaster in Texas? And Texas is ranked first in the US in the variety and frequency of natural disasters. In fact, there's at least one major disaster event declared in Texas every year. So here are some other statistics. There's a paper that goes along with this, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the statistics because it's important for us to understand how natural disasters, which impact the entire state, would really also impact a community association, right? But among them, there are heat-related statistics that I just wanted to point out. And actually right now, we're fortunate because it's cooling off a little bit. We had a really good rain here in Houston this morning, but heat, in my opinion, is like the current natural disaster that we're all having to endure. The number of 100-degree days are more than doubling. That has more than doubled over the last 40 years, and it could double again by 2036. I actually spiraled after reading that statistic because I'm not really sure how much hotter we could take it here. But the average expected temperature in 2036 will be about 3 degrees warmer than the average over the last century. And so, as Texans, we should expect extreme monthly summertime temperatures to increase. And that sounds terrible to me, but, that also leads to other things like, people needing to use water to make sure that their grass doesn't die and the plants don't die, making sure that their foundation doesn't crack because it's getting too hot. These are all things that could lead to homeowners having to spend a lot more money. Interestingly, too, according to FEMA, since 1953, there have been 372 federally declared disasters here in Texas. That's the most of any state in the nation. And Texas has the most billion-dollar climate disaster since 1980. So here's a couple of statistics about Texas, right? So while flooding is the number one, we have 258 declarations of fire-related natural disasters here in Texas. And if you look at the little map that I have on there, you can see that top half pretty much of the state experiences fires more than anywhere else. And that's something that I didn't really consider. But then flooding, of course, in that lower half where we're closer to the coast there. So these are all things that would affect an association, because if you think about it, a wildfire spreading through and creating damage throughout the entire community, that sort of responsibility not only falls on the homeowners to, recuperate things, but also for the community or the association to figure out how to make sure that they can pay for things like this, make sure that they have insurance that covers things like this. All right, so because we know that there are going to be some natural disasters, that those two slides that I just talked about in the statistics show that the likelihood of a natural disaster is actually going to increase, then we need to make sure that we provide some practical tips for our clients so that they can make preparations before a natural disaster happens. And we're talking about this because preparedness is important. Every year, there's also a big push for, hurricane season preparedness and things like this. These natural disasters really take a toll on a community and can really deplete their funds. So if we plan in advance, then that helps to make it so that we're not in some sort of trouble in the future as far as money is concerned. So the first practical tip that I always give my clients is to make sure that they open a capital reserve account. Now, this should already be done at the beginning when the association is created. There should be a capital reserve account. But if there isn't one, then this needs to be a very important first step. This reserve account will be used for expenses such as a fence or a roof replacement project, new playground equipment if the association has common areas like that, and maybe even replastering the community pool. Another tip is to develop a maintenance schedule. So routine checks of the common area amenities and utilities like the roof, electrical system, and the pool, we will definitely save the association a significant amount of money in the long run. And what may be considered routine could really vary depending on the type of association that we're dealing with. But some sort of comprehensive inspection every 3 to 5 years would suffice for most associations. And with that, another recommendation is to undertake a reserve study. Now, throughout the presentation, you'll hear me talk about reserve studies. And this is really a on-site inspection of the community and its facilities that provides the board with a funding plan to assist them with anticipating and preparing for major repair and or replacement projects. Now, a reserve study also assists the community in creating their budget, and that ensures that owners are actually contributing their fair share towards the reserve account. This will ultimately help the association handle any major issues that come up or that might be exacerbated after a natural disaster. And then finally, we want to take a look at the association's insurance coverages. And honestly, these are tips that us as individuals, as homeowners, as renters, or whatever, can really take on and implement in our day-to-day lives, because it's important that we have, money saved away, and we're taking a look at things that are going on in our house, doing an inspection of things, and then making sure that we have the proper insurance coverages, because during times like Allison or whatever, you heard story after story of people not having sufficient insurance to cover the damage that happened to their properties from floods. So likewise, with an association, they need to make sure that they have the proper insurance coverages like general liability and property insurance coverage that protects all common areas and buildings. This is not only really important for like a single family community that has all freestanding homes, but also for a condominium association, because the common areas are things that can be affected by natural disasters as well. And of course, I also recommend having flood insurance because, of course, we live in Texas. Insurance coverage and minimum policy limits are often mandated by the association's governing document. A lot of time, the restrictions require that there be some sort of insurance coverage. So it's always a good idea to kind of review the association's governing documents and along with their insurance policies routinely to make sure that the association is adequately covered in the event of a disaster. And then, of course, if the association has tips, then they should reach out to their counsel or their insurance agent with any questions. All right, so I mentioned this, right? Insurance coverage, you need to make sure you have adequate general liability and property insurance coverage, protecting all common areas and buildings. Associations generally also have director and officers liability insurance. This insurance goes to protect the association and the board members against things like lawsuits filed by other entities or homeowners. And then flood insurance is really important as well. So the D&O insurance will kick in if the association gets sued for some sort of reason. That insurance will appoint an attorney to defend the association and pay the legal fees up to a certain point as well. All right, so insurance is also obviously really important because you want to make sure that you have the adequate amount of coverage that I mentioned, right? So having a conversation and making decisions about insurance is important to do, ahead of time. It's going to be different from one association to the next. So again, you want to make sure you work with your insurance carrier and attorney, and make sure you review the governing documents to determine whatever policies might be necessary for the association to maintain. I repeat this because it's actually really important. A lot of people aren't aware of the requirements of insurance for community associations. So we want to make sure that we educate them to let them know that they should have these proper policies in place so that they are not caught with their pants down, so to speak, when things happen. Another thing with insurance, though, is that you can do things to kind of mitigate damages, right? So I'm sure that some of you have heard about recent events such as the Chaplain Towers incident where the condo actually collapsed in Florida. And of course, that was a terrible incident. It kind of rocked the community associations world because it brought up a lot of issues. But it also led to a lot of homeowners giving greater scrutiny to community associations and the activities that they have. So they're making sure that the association is structurally sound. They're making sure that the association is properly funded before they're actually following through with purchasing a unit or purchasing a property that's within a community. And this can be problematic because sometimes it can lead to a sale falling through or something like that. But in addition to homeowners paying more attention, mortgage companies, lenders, and insurance carriers are also paying closer attention to association maintenance and their business practices. And so because of this, the association might consider implementing certain mitigating maintenance practices, I like to call them, like during those inspections that I mentioned on the slide before, making sure that if the association has any piping or draining, that they are cleared of debris, because that will help to reduce flooding and water backup. And if the association has a bunch of trees, then tree maintenance is really important, making sure that you're trimming old or unsturdy trees. There's an association that I manage or that I represent that's here in Houston, and the manager contacted me several times because she was trying to convince the board that there were a couple of trees in the community that needed to be cut down because they were old and dying, and like one stiff breeze would knock them over and cause a lot of damage to the community. It was one of those communities too where the units were kind of in a square and the common area was right in the middle, so the trees were right in the middle, so whatever way they fell, they would definitely fall onto someone's unit. I think she was able to inevitably talk them into making sure that they got that tree cut down because she could foresee the type of issues that they would have, the money that they would have to pay out in order to, get that tree picked up, fix all the damage that tree created, and then whatever possible lawsuits that they might be subject to because they failed to make sure that they did this sort of maintenance that was required. And then also you want to do things like eliminate or reduce fuel for wildfire. So if there's any dead branches or leaves or anything just kind of laying around, make sure that the landscaper gets that stuff picked up so that it doesn't ignite if a fire happens or something like that. So these are just some practical, community maintenance tips that should be implemented to make sure that the association is prepared for these inevitable natural disasters. So another issue with insurance is that there are, especially after this Chaplain Towers incident, a lot of carriers have been considering adding further restrictions and exclusions to insurance policies. And really, industry-wide for both single-family and condominium associations, the number of insurers and available policies have been trending downward in the last few years. And they are not only are they trending downward, but they're being charged at a higher rate with lower policy limits. So that may not be truly adequate for the association's needs. And what's interesting too is major carriers like in California, for example, like State Farm and Allstate, they are no longer writing new home insurance policies. And one of the reasons that they cited is natural disasters, especially in California, where there are so many wildfires. The damage and the cost associated with new construction or repairs, those carriers are just concerned about losing money. So, it's interesting that California has taken that step. And, with Texas being one of the places that has the most natural disasters in the country, are we one step away from carriers kind of following suit? I mean, that would definitely create further limitations on property owners associations because there's already limited policies, but it's just something that we have to be cognizant of and look out for in the future. It's not something that's projected to happen, but we want to just kind of keep an eye on that. So another thing about insurance, sorry, that's one too many slides. Another thing about insurance too, of course, there's been an increase in claims. So for example, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are now requiring buyers to seek greater information on the deferred maintenance of an association, which I'll explain in just a second. In addition to deferred maintenance, they're looking at whether or not the association has had a reserve study in the past, and whether or not there have been any engineering studies in the past. And those are all important things to kind of look at the structural, big ticket items that are going on in the association. Now, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae will hand out these sort of questionnaires that are required for types of loans that they hand out, and they could potentially create additional liability for associations, because if they answer any of the questions on the questionnaire incorrectly, not because they're intentionally doing that, but just, that might happen, then that could cause the loss of a sale of a unit or of a property, and send a signal about future assessments due to deferred maintenance. So I talk about deferred maintenance. That essentially just means that the association has to defer a major maintenance project until sometime in the future, because they simply don't have the money to pay for it. So again, generally, we are seeing a trend towards fewer policies available. And when they are available, they are very expensive, almost prohibitively so. And so that's leaving a lot of communities without the proper insurance and making them vulnerable to having to spend tons of money in the event that something happens. All right, so that's it on insurance. We're going to start talking about agriculture. And, during the last few legislative sessions, there have been several bills introduced related to chickens and agricultural matters. And believe it or not, these would greatly impact property owners associations. For example, there was HB 276 that was introduced for this session, and that would have amended section 202.024 of the property code. And it would have allowed the growing of fruits and vegetables, the raising of 6 or fewer domestic fowl or adult rabbits, and then also the production of food at a home-based cottage food production operation. Now, I want you to just put this in perspective for a little bit and think about what it would look like if all of the neighbors in your HOA had chickens running around or a garden in their front yard. Now, of course, people need gardens. That's great. A lot of people I started what I like to call my anxiety garden during COVID, which has since gone by the wayside. But of course, it produced several great fruits and vegetables, and it was amazing to watch everything grow. But I also had it in the backyard of my property, and I kept it very nice and neat. But just imagine what would happen if someone didn't do that. And what this bill would have allowed would have been for people to actually put a garden or a fruit and vegetable garden in their front yard or on the side or something like that. So if you can imagine that your next door neighbor, who already doesn't mow his yard on a weekly basis, now allows for a fruit and vegetable garden to overgrow, and it is also attracting other animals and bugs and snakes or what have you. This is something that could be very detrimental to not only just the aesthetic of the property and creating a nuisance, but also it could really diminish property values. And one of the points, the whole entire purpose of a community association, is to make sure that it is doing things to maintain property values. Another thing is with these chickens. Now, just to interject, the bill didn't pass. A chicken bill has never passed. And so currently the association can still regulate things like a front yard vegetable garden, regardless of whatever local ordinances might be in place. But also, let's think about chickens, for example. It is becoming increasingly more popular for people to try to raise chickens and even to grow your own produce in suburban areas. And this trend is gaining more popularity, and especially in the face of inflation and escalating egg prices. We had that whole fiasco where eggs were like up to $10 or something crazy like that, and higher food prices in general. Now, listen, people want free eggs, but they don't consider the cost of owning and maintaining chickens. Chickens can be loud, they're messy, they attract coyotes, and arguably they are just really best suited for rural country life. Chickens also carry disease. Avian flu, that was a chicken thing, right? So think about, what happens when a homeowner, if they do have a chicken coop and they followed all the rules, but at some point they, fail to maintain those chickens and fail to take care of them, fail to properly feed them or keep it clean or, that kind of thing. then you're going to have a situation on your hands. And not only that, the chicken is going to be, you know, cockadoodle doodling and waking you up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day. And so these are things that we all should just kind of consider when we're talking about allowing people to just have wildlife or have gardens willy-nilly in their yards. If an association doesn't have the ability to self-govern and put some sort of regulations on these kind of things, then everything's going to go crazy. Now, if a bill does eventually get signed into law that allows chickens in a property owners association or something like that, then the association would definitely need to develop a policy that puts some rules in place so chickens are not just roaming free in the community. I don't know, maybe they should have to leash their chickens or something. I don't know. But at least there will be some sort of rule in place. The association maintains their power of enforcement, and it prevents things like chickens going wild and people just having, you know, gardens that go crazy and aren't maintained. So that's some of the issues with agriculture that we're facing right now. In addition to that, there are other bills that you know were presented during this legislative session where a homeowner could put a wind turbine in their property. You know, those big white wind turbines that you see in Palm Springs, that they have rows and rows of them. So the bill basically said that a person could put that sort of wind turbine. It didn't have any restrictions on height or width or anything like that, and they could just plop it down in their yard. Now, if you can imagine the noise or like the wind tunnel that those things would create, or even just driving through a community and seeing a big white wind turbine in someone's front yard, again, those are things that really diminish a property value of surrounding properties. And these are all going towards, you know, people are more into the whole trend of agricultural improvement and things like that. But that's fine for somewhere that has more space, or, you know, somewhere that allows those sorts of things. But there are more people, I promise, in community associations who would not like those sorts of things to happen. Another issue that we run into with agriculture is people bringing in, and this can be an entirely different topic, but people bringing in assistance animals and bringing in chickens or things like that under the guise of assistance animals. Now, sometimes these are assistance animals and people do need them. But, you know, there are certain things that the association can do in order to regulate that as well. There are certain exceptions to the FHA so that the association doesn't find itself in the face of a disability discrimination claim or anything like that. Again, we can talk about that for a whole nother hour, but these are just some of the issues that we're running into as far as agriculture is concerned. All right, so now let's talk about artificial intelligence. And I'll tell you a funny story about this in just a second, but is anyone else slightly concerned about AI? I mean, honestly, it seems like we're stuck in a movie where like AI is developed, it builds malicious intentions over time, and then it takes over the world, kind of like the theme of the Terminator. Well, I don't know, it scares me a little bit, but how is AI relevant to the POA industry? Well, of course, the AI is only going to be as good as the data submitted. Now, it can be a really important tool in determining things like appropriate predictive maintenance. We've talked a lot about maintenance and how important that is. In other words, the AI could really analyze data systems to predict when equipment or structures or even appliances should be replaced and repaired. Now, this could really help to prevent any catastrophic and costly incidents. Another benefit for AI could be board members having access to data or finding out information or getting education, learning best practices, communicating information more quickly and efficiently, and even potentially eliminate the need for inspections because we have the data analysis. But this could be a really good tool because it could provide board members with some of the things that they might need, things that take up time. You know, they have to send an email to a manager and wait for a little while to get a response. But if there was AI in the picture, maybe, you know, we'll cut down on a little bit more of that time and maybe cut down on some of the expenses. AI can also really come into play by providing homeowners with answers for any questions that might come up that might be found in the governing documents. It could really eliminate the need for frequent calls and emails to the attorney or the community manager. But with that, security might become an issue. Associations, and particularly their board members, are frequently entrusted with homeowners' sensitive confidential information that might include PII or personally identifiable information. And with that, I'm talking about like social security numbers, financial information like credit cards and bank accounts, right? Now, POAs definitely have a responsibility and even a duty to take reasonable precautions to protect members' confidential information. And in Texas, there are statutes that impose legal obligations for the protection of this kind of sensitive information. So it would behoove an association to make sure that it's taking the necessary steps to protect that, right? But even more so, not just the association, but the officers and board members themselves might owe a heightened legal duty to members and the association itself. And that can be found in the Texas Business Organizations Code. Property owners associations are nonprofit corporations, so they're governed by Chapter 22 of the TBOC. Now, since AI still, there can be a lot of benefits to it, but it still has the potential to negatively affect homeowner data and information that might be protected by statute, then the association definitely has to exercise caution when implementing any programs like ChatGPT or anything like that. We want to make sure that even though you have all of this information, you don't want to make it vulnerable, because that could obviously be problematic. But there's a story that I can tell you about here. Did you guys hear about the attorney in New York that used ChatGPT he created a brief in court? Okay, let me tell you the story. It was all over the news. So this attorney was involved in some sort of case in New York, and his opposing counsel created a brief and he needed to respond to it. So he used ChatGPT to create his brief and he submitted it to the court. It was filed. Opposing counsel then starts reading it, and as he's looking through it, he's looking up the citations in this brief and realizing that none of them are real. All of them were generated out of nowhere by the AI. And so this led to, the judge, of course, opposing counsel filed some sort of motion to alert the judge that this was going on. And of course, the judge was like, oh my, are you kidding me? So he calls the attorney into court. And I think that I would have been mortified if something like this had happened, of course. So this leads to a couple of things, right? Complete and total embarrassment for the attorney, making him want to hide under a rock, I'm sure. This full story was in newspapers and on the news all over the country, but it also has some judges, local judges, issuing rules and requiring sworn statements from their attorneys related to generating documents using AI. So they have to, make this sworn statement that says, okay, yes, I used AI to create this brief, but I went behind it and checked to make sure that at least the citations were actually legitimate citations, right? So with this sort of thing, and honestly, this is like the utmost level of embarrassment for an attorney to come in and have a judge, call you out because your work is not your own. And it honestly it's lazy, if we're being honest. But, checks and balances are really important with things like this, because it's so important to consider whether or not that AI is actually spitting out the information that you really need for it to spit out. So we don't want to take the quick route, even though, I could generate 100 briefs in one day with AI, but you really need to have that human comprehension and decision-making that really needs to be a part of any sort of pleading or anything that's being created. And this is not just to say that attorneys might be guilty of this or dealing with briefs that are filed in court, but in the POA world, we are constantly drafting documents and making amendments, creating policies and rules and regulations. And those things are not something that can just be easily generated by AI, because you need to know the community, know what their governing documents say. And then at the same time, you got to be familiar with what the property code says or what new legislation is coming out and that sort of thing. So it makes it a little bit more difficult for us to kind of take those shortcuts. So it's important to just, pay attention to what you're doing. I'm not saying that I wouldn't use AI, but again, it's only as good as the data submitted. So you got to make sure that you're paying attention to what's being spit out of the AI. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about EV charging stations. And this is important because I know that everyone has seen Tesla, and every new car manufacturer has come out with some sort of electronic vehicle, right? The statistics show that at least 5% of new car sales are powered by electricity. And that is a threshold that really signals the start of mass EV adoption. And not only are you seeing EV all over the place, Teslas, so on and so forth, but you're also seeing charging stations pop up because, of course, you can't just have the charging station at your house. And similar to gas stations, people need to be able to charge their cars wherever they go. Now, the implications for this for a single family versus condominium community are really different. Most electronic car owners also own their own house. and relatively few live in condos with shared parking areas. And that is just for now, right? Of course, we're seeing this like influx in people owning electronic vehicles. So of course, at some point, condominium owners will also, share with the similar statistics as single family owners. Now, one of the challenges that an EV owner might face as a member of a condo association is the property parking type. Are they parking in a spot that has been deeded to them, or is it owned by the property owners association? Now, why is this important? Well, if the spaces are deeded, then perhaps the cost of installation will typically be borne by the homeowner. But if it is a POA owned space, then the association could be responsible for all costs, but still you have to consider the logistical concerns. It's different because if you're talking about installing a EV charging station at your home, the only time you would really have to petition the association is whether if you're going to put it like out in the front, like it's seen in this picture here. But generally that charging station will be inside in your garage, and it's not something the association would ever see. And it's not something that they regulate. So you don't have to worry about them getting involved at all. But this is just kind of a big issue because if you think about it, with the uptick of electronic vehicles on the road, some associations have been considering installing charging stations, but they have to think about how they can do that, how they can implement that, look at the logistics of it, but also the cost, right? And this might be a reasonable undertaking in a single family community or even a new development where they're just building everything and they're thinking, okay, we're going to put a charging station in the community. But unfortunately, a lot of times the infrastructure, whether we're talking about physical or electrical of some older condominium buildings, it may be prohibitive to these types of improvements. So we really have to take a look at things like network design, engineering, and connectivity. Those are all important, but also these all are things that cost money to the association. Another major challenge associated with installation, whether it's by the individual or the association, is cost. I've talked about cost a little bit, but listen to this stat. The general installation cost alone, just the installation of a charging station, can be 70 to 80% of the cost. So that's pretty expensive. Now, in addition, installing a charging station on community property would require maybe an adjustment to the association's insurance policy, and that might also come with a hefty price tag. And then also, if you are considering a charging station, then I would recommend that there be some sort of charging policy, a charging station policy. Implementing a policy like that is going to cost a little money because you're going to have the attorney draft that up. So these are all things that are pretty costly, right? Now, there are some jurisdictions that have passed right to charge laws like Florida, California, Colorado, so on and so forth. These are designed to prevent an HOA and a condo board from stopping residents from installing charging stations. They don't, however, necessarily require the condo association to cover the cost of the charging points. And so that means that the owner is going to be responsible for payment of that stuff. Now, I talked about a charging station policy. It's really important that if you're going to create a policy like this, you want to first go and look to make sure that the association has the right to promulgate rules like this. And then in that policy, I would add things like requiring approval from the Architectural Control Committee, maybe putting specific items that have to be included in the application, like it has to be installed by a permitted contractor. If there are any deposits the association requires, any fees that it might require to maybe access the association's electrical source. And then if there are any other like after installation considerations, maybe providing the association with a certificate of insurance, naming the association with as an insured, and then possibly adding any disclaimers and indemnification provisions where appropriate. These are all things that you might want to consider if you're going to provide a charging station for a community, but also that policy is going to be really important. All right, let's talk about social media. Social media is not ideal for community associations. And actually, while I was drafting the paper that goes along with this, I received an email from a client with concerns about a homeowner's angry and aggressive Facebook postings and how they might affect the community. I will tell you that I've been practicing this type of law since 2017. A week doesn't go by where I have someone contact me and try to ask me how to handle an angry Facebook post or an angry next door neighbor post or something like that. And in this situation where a client called me, what was happening was that a small but very loud group of homeowners were spreading misinformation about the community online, and those posts were gaining traction. They were getting a lot of comments and a lot of reposts and stuff like that. Now, for many years, sorry about this noise right here, guys. I'm not in my own office, and I know it's distracting. For many years, though, attorneys would advise their clients to not have social media pages at all. There were concerns regarding the regulation of free speech, or that the page would turn into platforms for board members and neighbors to just bash each other, which that often happens, right? But ultimately, it was believed that social media pages were causing more problems than they actually solved, and it was increasing the potential for liability, which is something that we always like to avoid, right? Whatever we do, we want to decrease the potential for liability. But it's 2023, and social media has actually consumed more and more of our lives. So homeowner expectations have risen as far as associations having a social media presence, and hopefully that the presence is for the purpose of sharing community updates, event information, and emergency announcements. But of course, like I said, it does end up turning into a bashing session every now and again, but hopefully I can provide you with a couple of tips to help to kind of keep that from happening. So if you do want to use social media, then it's definitely important for the association to have some plan. And I feel like where you start with the plan is figuring out what the purpose of the social media would be. So you're going to have a association run Facebook page. And what's the purpose of it? So a couple of purposes could be to push out information, to receive information, or to foster communication with members, between members. And that's fine, except for you're going to limit the content to a purpose, and you're not or to the purpose that we're just talking about. You're not going to allow things to really get out of hand. So it has to be monitored pretty frequently. And I would also make sure that you adopt a social media policy similar to an EV charging station policy that I talked about on the slide before. The association wants to put certain rules and regulations in place about how it's going to maintain its social media page, whatever the case may be, so that all the homeowners understand what the expectation is, and it makes it a little easier to kind of regulate things. It keeps it from going completely out of hand. So a social media policy needs to start out by defining the terms of use for the page. Obviously, we're going to talk about what that purpose is, and we're going to state that up front, in big bold letters, so that people understand that the purpose of this page is to foster communication and not to post classified ads, or not to post things about a garage sale, right? You will make sure that it consists of community related posts, identify the scope of those posts. If you are going to allow lost pet or classified ads or social activities, then you can say that. But if you're not, then that's something that needs to be said as well, right? So along with defining the types of content, the social media page also needs to identify the types of posts that would not be allowed, and that information needs to go into your policy. Of course, you don't want to allow obscene or unlawful posts, or posts that are harassing or threatening in nature. It's also strongly recommended to refrain from posting copyrighted materials or images, because again, we don't want to do anything to expose the association to liability. And it could also subject the page to be deleted by Facebook or something like that if you're posting some copyrighted material that doesn't belong to you. The policy should also include language that says that no advertising or junk messaging will be allowed on the page, because you don't want it to become a marketplace where homeowners advertise things, or posting other homeowners' addresses or other confidential information. And then also you want to make sure that images of homes or complaints regarding neighbor to neighbor disputes do not get posted on that page. And if they do, they get immediately deleted. And if you're going to create a policy, then the policy needs to set forth what sort of consequences would be imposed upon a homeowner if they violate the policy. So maybe the post would be deleted without notice, or if someone makes continued or egregious violations of the policy, then you would revoke their access to the page. But most importantly, you want to make sure that you are identifying who the administrators are. So maybe it's going to be a board member, or if there's a social media committee, maybe that person can do that. And then perhaps a manager can do it, but you have to take into consideration the cost factor as well. So once all of these steps are outlined in the policy, then the association is ready to launch its social media page. I'm spending a little bit more time on this because this is something that comes up so much, and people just simply don't know how to deal with it, because sometimes there is a official association page that's run by the community, but then unofficial pages can pop up. So how do you handle that? If there is a official page, but then unofficial pages pop up? Well, this really can pose a problem, because the association has no control over what gets posted on an unofficial Facebook page or unofficial social media page. And I actually have a situation that's going on right now in court where an ex-board member who was ousted for whatever reason, the association has filed a lawsuit against him for harassing and threatening the board members and preventing them from conducting board-related business. For example, because he's a recent board member, contacted the bank and shut down the association's bank account. So he's doing things like that to interfere with the association's business. In addition to that, he is creating Facebook pages and websites that appear to be official association pages and that are not. And so he's posting things on these pages that are not they are not direct communications coming from the board. And that's a no-no. So that's part of the reason why having a social media policy is really good, because it could put out reminders to people to make sure that they investigate and verify information before posting. Then the association can determine whether or not it wants to make any direct or indirect responses to any information that's being posted on these unofficial pages. Remind people in this policy that certain comments that they make regarding a person's character or reputation may trigger litigation or liability. And just kind of remind everyone that it's not productive for the community, because that's never a good thing, right? Having unofficial pages, obviously it's because someone has some sort of vendetta and they want to, secretly behind the board's back, talk about things that are going on. It's always negative. So it's not creating a positive, productive environment. It's not creating that community atmosphere that we want in the association either.
Hey, Nicole,
All right. Yes.
Can I interrupt for just 1 second while you're on that topic?
Sure.
Does that include, how do you handle the infamous Nextdoor? I've served on my HOA board for about 4 years, and during that time we had such negative postings on Nextdoor, and some of them were by a current board member, which is strictly a no-no. We had our attorney get involved in that. But you can't control Nextdoor, like you said earlier. So what is the ramification if either a current or former board member continues to use that? Because some people are just not smart enough to know only post in your neighborhood, and it goes out all over Dallas. And so you start seeing comments from everyone.
Right. So a couple things. First, I would start off by making sure we have a social media policy in place, right? If this is a board member, then you might want to take a look in your governing documents to see if they have violated any of their duties that they're supposed to uphold as a board member, and then also look at the removal provision in your bylaws to determine whether or not that this is an infraction that they could be removed for. But if not, some of the things that I'm talking about here, making a polite request of the user to remove the page or the posting would be something that you might be able to do. But then also, if necessary, if you figure out that this is something that really needs to be addressed across the entire community, then you might have something like a town hall meeting to discuss the post or discuss the posting in general, or, social media in general. This helps with transparency. It's really important that the community is transparent, because especially nowadays, people are more litigious than they have been. There's a lack of civility amongst community members. And to avoid claims or accusations that the board or the association is trying to hide things, then it's important to be transparent, right? Nothing is perfect, but you want to just make sure that you do things to make sure that you're communicating to the entire community. And if you are going to address this situation in an open meeting, a town hall meeting or something like that, I'd make sure to get the advice of the attorney on what is appropriate and not appropriate to say about it. But just to kind of talk through the issue, not pointing any fingers, not accusing people of posting things or anything like that, but talk about the content of the post and kind of dispel any rumors or any misinformation that's being posted online. And even if it gets to a point where the person is posting things and you can't get them to stop, then sometimes you might have to issue a cease and desist letter. And, that it just is what it is. A lot of times the board would be upset because people are saying things about them or, bad mouthing the community or anything like that. Sometimes the best thing for you to do is to be silent. So it's really important to just kind of evaluate what's going on, evaluate whether or not it's a good idea to actually say something, talk to your attorney about that, and allow the members in the community to verify information before they actually form an opinion. Sometimes people are just upset. Their emotions are involved. That, you know, a lot of times it's things having to do with their property. So it can be something that's really touchy for people, right? They're very sensitive about, you know, when you tell them that they need to move their trash can because it's their property and they can do whatever they want to. But you know, the rules are the rules. And part of the reason why people have bought into communities like this is because they want that sort of that governing structure to be able to make sure that the person next to them is mowing their yard in a timely fashion so that their property value stays up. So if they do decide that they want to sell at some point, that they can, right? So staying the course, time is your friend. Those are all things that are kind of important in the situation. All right, so the last thing that I'll talk about is the changing demographic of owners. Now, there are many other challenges that are facing Property Owners Association. We've talked about quite a few of them today, but one of the biggest ones is the changing demographic of the homeowner. So according to the National Association of Realtors, millennials made up the largest share of home buyers at about 43%, with boomers being at the largest group of sellers at 42%, and Gen Z at 2% of each. So with this increase in younger homeowners comes new ideas, advances in technology, and TikTok dances, obviously, right? Millennial and Gen Z homeowners rely heavily on technology, so it behooves the association and the industry as a whole to make strides to keep up with that demand with things like automation and online options, and kind of, you know, investigating whether or not AI would be a good thing, because that's really all the rage right now. Also, millennial and Gen Z homeowners are statistically less enthused by the association's use restrictions and less likely to be involved in POA matters. In fact, more than half of boomers, so that's about 52%, said that they love their POA, but just 39% of millennials and 31% of Gen Xers express such devotion. Boomers are much more likely to attend HOA board meetings, and nearly 40% of the younger cohorts have never even heard of an HOA board meeting. So they are far more less inclined to go to a meeting. And boomers are actually more inclined to complain about like a pet waste or some sort of use restriction. That was at 38%. And then Gen Xers are a little more than 20% for lodging complaints. So as you can see, you know, participation and engagement is really important for a community association, and it is getting more and more difficult to engage younger people because what they want to do is sit on their phones and, you know, watch social media, you know, scroll through TikTok all day. So to kind of combat this, a lot of associations that I work with have been trying to do things like have more activities or, you know, group events and things that appeal to more than just the older homeowners, but to kind of get everybody out there. So for example, with National Night Out, I think that's tonight, you'll see a variety of people, a variety of different demographic of homeowners out there because they're trying to get involved. You know, they want to take more interest and take a little bit more care into their properties and things like that. And because maybe their association has helped to kind of target them to bring them out a little bit and to get ideas or to know, you know, help get them more involved in the community. All right, so with that, those are all of the slides that I have today. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to a couple of questions. We have about a couple minutes and I'll answer whatever questions I can. And anything else, you guys can kind of send me an email if you want to, and I can answer the questions. So the first one is, will the PowerPoint be available? And I think that this is being recorded, so I think the entire presentation will be available. And I am just scrolling. Okay. Does D&O insurance also cover bad faith on the part of the HOA? So that is probably a no. Generally, property owners association boards have a duty to act in good faith. And so if they have stepped outside of that duty, then it is not likely that the insurance will cover whatever activity or defend whatever lawsuit that they're being sued for. But it's important to look at what the policy will cover, just to see if you know, they'll be covered for whatever they're being sued for, but for bad faith, not likely. All right, let's see.
Yeah, I remember I used to be a mortgage underwriter, and I would look at condo policies and look at, you know, we'd had to evaluate condos on quite a lot of items like amount of reserves, etc. And I think on some policies they did cover embezzlement and things like that, but probably not all. But
it really, it definitely just depends, because like I said, that they do have a duty to act in good faith, but then also they have a duty to act with reasonableness, right? So they can rely on experts like an attorney or an accountant or something like that, but they can't just like, go out and make bad decisions, especially if they know that those decisions are bad ones. Because that kind of shows that they were willing to, or some sort of negligence on their part. It's a breach of their duty. So it's not likely that they will be covered.
What about the case that you're working on now with that guy who, I guess, took some people off the account or whatever?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
What's gonna happen? Isn't that a crime?
Yeah, it can be considered a crime. So we're handling it in a civil matter, but we're representing the board. So so he's filed a counterclaim against the board now for harassment and things of that nature, but we're representing the board. And the insurance has kicked in to cover their legal fees for defense of that counterclaim. But as far as the affirmative defense or the affirmative claims against this ex-board member, we're still pursuing that, and the board has to come out of pocket to pay that.
Okay, yeah, because I'm just kind of worried if he's still has control of the bank account, that could be a real issue.
Well, he no longer does, but at the time it was unclear. Yeah, at the time it was unclear. So the bank just kind of went with what they thought, was the right information.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. So it's 1 o'clock, and I think that's my time. Elena or anybody else?
Yes, thank you so
Okay.
much, Ms. Hicks. That was interesting information. I really appreciate that. And thank you for everyone for attending and giving us your lunch hour. If you would like to request a CLE certificate, Veronica has placed in the chat room the password that you need to give, as well as the email address you need to send your request to. So please look in the chat room for that information. And if you would like the CLE certificate, please send that information, that request to us via email. Also, if you would like Ms. Hicks' information, I'll be glad to give that to you as well. And I believe she's placed it on the screen as well.
This is our
Again.
offices, but my email is nhicks@rmwbh if you guys want to reach out. Okay. Well, it was nice to see you all today. Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking your time to sit here with me. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ms. Hicks. I really appreciate that. That was really some good information. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.